when we are seeing in the Town and Country the premiere of the wonder material Dynock. Yes, the thing that strikes terror in David's heart and annoys the heck out of you, Warren. Yes. Hi, and welcome back to the Audrain Automobile Museum and our exhibition, Wonders in Wood, on Land and by Sea. For today's exhibition highlights video, we're joined by a very special guest and friend, Warren Barker. Warren's a senior instructor at IYRS, the School for Technology and Trades, in boat building and restoration. Welcome, Warren.
Well, hello and thanks.
And we're also here, of course, with David Denuzio, our Executive Director and Chief Curator. Warren, a few weeks ago you did a great presentation for us, one of our seminars in this exhibition, in which you talked all about, you walked the seminar participants through the art of building a wooden boat. Now, we're not going to get into that kind of detail here in this video, but you will be able to see the video of that seminar here on the Audrain Museum Network. So, today we're talking about how boats are built in terms of the actual techniques of construction and perhaps some of the reasons why they use those techniques. We're starting to talk about this really neat boat, which looks like a very old boat, but in fact is actually a contemporary boat. This is a 1995 or 2005? 2005 Peapod. And what can you tell me about this, Warren? The fact that this looks like a very old boat, but it was still built recently.
Well, I can say one thing about it, it's time tested. I mean, it's a main Peapod, and Peapods we use for fishing, clamming, everything. And Jimmy Steele, who built this boat, he was an absolute wizard at building boats. He'd made up techniques, he invented things. As he got older, he even figured out a pneumatic device that he'd stamp his foot and he could clench the nails, and he was an amazing person and funny. So I think it's so cool this boat is here because it celebrates not only the Maine coast and these, time-tested designs, but celebrates Jimmy Steele, who he was a great individual. So when I look at a Peapod like this, I notice it's a Carvel planked. So that means it's a smooth skin hull. And what I always think of in the Maine coast is that if you hit something like a rock, and there are plenty of them, it's very unforgiving. So what's really nice about this hull is if you bang this hull up, you can repair it. And that, it's tough, it takes a lot of wear and tear, but when it needs to be fixed, it's pretty easy to do it. So what we have is a crazy functional shape, design, ability, but also fixable, so it makes it, on the utilitarian end of it, an exquisite design.
Perfect, Warren.
This one's fancy.
That fits right into a theme that we've been working on throughout the exhibition videos here, to talk about the ways wood is used in boats and in cars for utility, efficiency, style, and fashion. And you hit the nail on the head so beautifully about why this boat is built the way it's built and the purpose for its use. Now, also talk a little bit about the fact that, boating off the Maine coast, as you said, it's very, very rocky. And it's also a boat with two ends. So is there a difference between a boat like this and a design with a boat with a bow and a stern?
Well, a lot has to do with efficiency. Basically efficiency moving through the water. However, as you probably know, it's one thing to have something that has to be elongated so you can retrieve that laminar flow, but on and on you could go. So it works fine for this design, but some people do get tired rowing around, especially when they're trying to make a living. So it quickly became apparent you could chop off the stern and put some kind of engine back there. The boat wouldn't have to be so long if you wanted to put a person back there. So basically you had this carrying capacity. This is the perfect size for what it was intended to do, but once you start to say, well, I have to put more people in it, I'm going to power it, it's all a question of where you need your displacement and how to use the design. So the Rangeley Lake boats, they're from Rangeley Lake, Maine, they quickly chop the sterns off and put little outboards, and I like the double-enders a lot better. It's a gorgeous looking thing, a double-ended boat.
It is absolutely beautiful. It reminds me, of course, in a larger scale, of those beautiful lake canoes. That's the perfect form, just so incredibly elegant. Going back to the boats that they used in ancient Egypt, it's that perfect form. Now, we're talking about the utility of boats. What would a boat like this have been built for when it was brand new?
This
yes.
one, I think originally for making a living as a lobsterman, fisherman, clamor. I mean,
working in and around the coast, near shore.
In close. But, I mean, of course you can extend the thing, and you realize, I mean, look at the Vikings. They knew the thing would go fast if it had double ends. I mean, it was just, nobody figured it out. They just did it and said that worked, I think.
It's one of the things that we actually explored a bit in the last exhibition we had in the museum, Landmarks in Early Automotive Engineering. The times when people just sort of invented things because people said, no one had told them yet, you can't do that, so therefore they did it. Now, David, you mentioned something else right before we started shooting about the fact that this boat is also surprisingly stable in fairly heavy seas. Now, what are the characteristics of the boat that allow that to happen?
Well, having a pointed stern, you can row it in both directions. I think it's maneuverable. Water breaks differently over a point than it does a flat stern. So that can help and hurt you. You'll notice it also has tall oarlocks, so you can row it while standing while you're working. Another thing we talked about earlier was Jimmy Steele gave car names to the models of boats. He had this came as the Chevrolet, the Cadillac, and the Rolls Royce. I imagine the traditional lobsterman's workboat was all painted inside and out. That would be the Chevy. This is the Cadillac. It has some some bright work on it, and of course, Rolls Royce would be all bright work, and a lot more maintenance. So.
And now, Warren, when you're building a boat, now we'll get into a little discussion about this later, or we may not. Depends on how dangerous we want to make the conversation. But obviously, wood means a lot to you. Is there a difference in the woods that you choose for a boat when you know it's going to be varnished versus one that you know is going to be painted?
Ooh, it depends on the client. But usually you go to the more exotics when you varnish them. But now I'm going to take that back. No,
everything is absolute until it's
not. Because white cedar, so this would be planked in northern white cedar. And white cedar looks fine varnished, but northern white has a lot of knots in it. And I know that the main builders prefer northern white cedar. Whereas we use what the main builders call juniper. It's Atlantic white cedar, and it's all the way from the Florida Panhandle to Cape Ann, and that has very few knots in it. So if you went to the Rolls Royce, you would probably either carry on with your mahogany as the sheer strake is here, or you would go to Atlantic white where it's perfectly clear. The main builders squawk. They say the Atlantic white tends to split. The northern white's tougher. So it all depends on who's building for whom.
Well, and to your earlier point about the purpose of this boat, why it was built, and materials that you want to choose for it because of its intended use. If it was being built for its intended use, you want to make sure that it's absolutely as strong as it could possibly be. If you're using it more for amusement and recreation, then that ultimate durability is probably not as important.
Yeah, this one has some amusement and recreation in it, that's for sure.
And speaking of amusement and recreation, and this is a really interesting and slightly heavy-handed segue, but nonetheless, I think I will have pulled it off. Let's talk about this, the car that we're standing next to, this Morris Oxford Woody shooting brake estate car. Now, this is a car that we've discussed in some of our earlier videos. It's very much built in the style that they built wagons in England since the 16th century. And David, now the ways that this was very much a working boat and the way it was built determined some of the factors of the woods choose, etc. How are there similarities, or are there similarities between what we see in this Morris and what we see there in the Peapod?
I think the woods are chosen intentionally. It looks to be red pine for the panels, and the frames, they're often done in white oak or ash. These heavy chamfers are typical of English construction more so than American construction. It's a stylistic thing. And traditional joinery that you would find some of the joints in boats, I suppose. A lap joint. There's a through Morrison tenon on the top rail. Some of the lap joints are held together with bolts or the brackets from the ironwork that sits outside of the body. But I guess it's very practical and purposeful, using domestic woods that they found readily in the area where it was built. The fact that it's varnished and not painted, I would say, points to it being an estate wagon. This wasn't this was a utility vehicle, but also used on an estate. You wanted it to look good. It could have simply been painted with a brush, but it wasn't. So, and that way it's sort of like a boat, whether it's totally practical or maybe one step above, showing varnish.
I think that one of the things that you mentioned, Warren, I think that really carries on to the car. I mean, at this point, Morris was offering all steel bodies in their sedans. So clearly this was a style statement to do this wood body. But also the fact that this is the Peapod is a very practical working boat, and yet it has an incredible elegance and presence to it. And I think this is a working vehicle for an estate, but yet has an incredible presence and style. So I think that that's something that only the wood can add.
Yeah. It's interesting that the panels are also, they're just set into rabbets on the inside. So if you look at the interior, the wood runs continuously horizontally, just like in a modern pickup truck, really. So that's, a practical thing. You're not going to, if you're pushing things in and out of it, you're not getting caught up on the frame and panel construction per se.
They're not so worried about the airflow going over that as
Right.
they are about the water going past that. So
Good point. Yeah.
it just turned inside out.
Exactly. Oh, and speaking of turning inside out, let's talk for just a second about the ribs and the spacing of the ribs, how they're made. I know that obviously one of the things that I saw when I visited IYRS and saw some of the work that you were doing with the students, it's incredible to look at the way these boats are planned, designed, drawn, and how is it determined, how far the ribs are apart, depending on the use of the boat, and all of that. So give us a little insight into that, Warren.
Well, why I just went like this and looked inside is that these ribs, quite often the ribs are aligned perpendicular to center line, whereas in this boat they actually flare out like that, and it's an extraordinary effect. And the spacing, basically, can I say trial and error?
Yes, you can.
They put them 12 inches apart, and to save time, and the thing fell apart. So he decided that, okay, I'm going to space them, whatever this is, looks like about 6 inches apart. But then he's fanned them out. So he started in the center where they're basically perpendicular to center line, and then he divvied up the shear line, which is longer than the center line, and had them flare out like that. It's a beautiful, beautiful effect. However, it's hard to do. And you always try to figure out what looks right with the fanning. One of the things also is that the rib doesn't want to do it, and you have to force it into that shape. It would much prefer to wrap around and go like that, which looks terrible. So telling that rib what Jimmy Steele wanted to do, he put some effort into it. There's a builder right up close to him, Frank Day, late Frank Day. A friend of mine bought one of his Peapods. Doesn't have this sweeping shear line, fairly flat shear. He bent all those ribs on a little form and then fired them into the boat later. It's a very different effect, but they both have the same intent. They just build basically a rib cage so that you can wrap this skin around it that lets it move through the water efficiently and makes it super strong.
And how are the planks fastened to the ribs?
These guys are riveted, so well, it makes it not quite as easy to repair as a screw fastened hull, but they're fantastic. I mean, a riveted hull is strong. You don't see
the rivets on the outside, so I assume they were recessed and then puttied over or filled?
Yeah, and quite often your backing iron will have a point on it, and you can countersink the rivet a little bit and then putty it. So that's how I think he did that. And that's where he came up with that pneumatic.
Clever.
Yeah, and it was pushed on his heel and little oomph and
necessity, invention.
Yeah.
Now, Warren, David, let's take a look at another hull which sort of shows the way it's built in a very obvious way, what I think that people found fascinating. Come, let's take a look.
Okay.
Now, we're here next to a very different looking boat. This Boston Pram dinghy is built in a different way than the Carvel style hull that we looked at on the other side, Warren. What's this that we've got here?
So this is Lapstrake or clinker built construction. And immediately you'll notice the hull isn't smooth. It has these long flowing lines. And what each of these lines, the planks actually overlap each other. So that's Lapstrake and Lapstreak, some people say, clinker built in England. But the best thing to know about this is that each one of these laps, it's like a longitudinal stringer running the length of the boat. Whereas Carvel planking, the planks came together like that, and it was nice and smooth. These are lapped like that and mechanically fastened. The Carvel planking was just screw fastened, or in Jimmy Steele's boat, riveted to the frames. Whereas the planks are riveted together and then they're riveted to the frames inside. What that allows the builder to do is make a much lighter hull. And Lapstrake hulls can be incredibly light. Herreshoff was known to make super light boats Lapstrake built.
So this boat is nearly 10 feet long with a 4-foot beam and only weighs 105 pounds. So that's remarkably light.
Oh, it allows you to do things you wouldn't dare do with Carvel. Mm. And so, I mean, we built a 26-foot rowing gig at Portsmouth Abbey School, and it had 1/4-inch planking. You wouldn't dare do that with Carvel planking. You would have to beef up your planking. It didn't have the longitudinals in it, so Lapstrake, and it's also, if you take real time with lining off your planking, and you just, when it's upside down on the molds and framed, you run these battens down and look at them. When they look nice, mark them, and then you will spile. That's how you get the shapes of the planks. You will derive this beautiful line. Mm. So the trouble is that if you screw up those lines, the boat, it looks terrible. So it's very unforgiving.
Yeah, it's an art to it.
It's also unforgiving in that you have to be very precise in the fitting of planks, because if you have to edge set them, that's to take a plank and push them that way to fit, it will open up sort of like an envelope, and the water will subsequently pour in.
So I know
is there a difference in the fluid dynamics, the way a Lapstrake boat goes through the water versus a Carvel?
Well, you'll hear fluid dynamic talk to you when you row them, because they definitely percolate. And some people absolutely love that sort of percolation going on as you're rowing. Some people say the fish don't like that percolation at all, but I'm not so sure. Rangeley Lake boats, again, they're Lapstrake planked, and they seem to catch fish. So
both Carvel planks and Lapstrake planks are steam bent, correct?
Yes, yeah.
So that same process, the heart of your shop is that enormous steam box you have going every day. So even after the planks are somewhat shaped, is that when they go into the steam box at that point?
Yeah, they're pretty much completely shaped, because you're always crossing your fingers that when they go up, they fit perfectly. Carvel planking, Carvel planking, you have this tiny little surface, whereas the surface that meets here is twice the thickness of the plank. So if you're careful, you can make these bevels that fit perfectly. Impossible, but anyway, and then rivet it together. Whereas there is another element of Carvel planking that is forgiving. So you have this tiny surface that fits like that. However, you're allowed to push the plank tight. These guys, you're not allowed to do that. They have to meet, and you can't, what's called, as I said before, edge set them, or you're in trouble.
You mentioned something else before, Warren, about the Peapod boat, about its use in a very sort of stressful environment where it could be dashed against rocks and need to be repaired. Now, this is not very repair friendly, correct? This method of construction.
Well, that's a great point, because I might be mistaken, but in Maine, you don't see that many Lapstrake boats. And it's pure conjecture, and it's me making a leap, I'm sure. But this is an awfully vulnerable edge. And so to me, the idea of taking this boat to some nice rocky shore and dragging it up, I mean, I know you cry with the Carvel plank boat too, but this one, to break off all these edges that you spent all that time trying to make look beautiful, it seems crazy vulnerable. So a Lapstrake boat, quite often you're looking for that light, a light, carefully built hull. They're all carefully built, but it's the light that you really want.
And that makes it utilitarian in the sense that you can put it up on deck on a larger boat. It's maybe easier to pull behind a larger boat. I don't know.
Don't know. That Peapod would tow beautifully, but it's you're able to take it in and out of the water easier, for one thing. Build a long, skinny boat that weighs nothing. It's a great system, and I find it a little more fun than Carvel, I have to say. You have these cool, tiny little planes, and you zip along, and then you have this bevels that fit just right, and then you take another cool, tiny little plane with a convex bottom, and you put a little hollow in that lap, and when it's riveted together, it pinches and makes it watertight. So that's another really important aspect of it, is that the boat can be left out of the water for a longer period of time than any Carvel plank boat, because you've got this mechanical fastening.
Yeah. So there's no adhesive. This is just a dry connection.
Yep, dry joint.
That's remarkable.
And one of the things, of course, that to me makes it so special is the fact that you can tell the material on which this is built. With the Carvel plank boat that's painted, it could be almost anything, sort of. But this, you know exactly what went into making this, and it shows its construction so honestly and beautifully.
Oh, I like that, honestly. Yeah, it's all out there. It better look good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now we're going to take a look at something we talked about: efficiency and utility and style and then fashion. We're going to look at something right now that I think epitomizes fashion, but we're also going to learn a little bit about what it has in common with the two construction techniques that we've just learned about. Let's take a look at a beautiful Chris craft.
Okay.
Well, we've seen two examples of very practical yet elegant working boats. Now we see a boat that was designed not to work at all. Just looking at this boat is a vacation. This is this absolutely wonderful 1948 Chris craft, and it's paired here in the exhibition with this also beautiful 1948 Chrysler Town and Country, and two better post-war American expressions of style and fashion could not be imagined. And of course, we're going to talk about the wood and the woodcraft that goes into this, but it's also at that moment, even though the Peapod, of course, was made in 2005, when we are seeing in the Town and Country the premiere of the wonder material Dynoc. Yes, the thing that strikes terror in David's heart and annoys the heck out of you, Warren. Yes, but let's not talk about Dynoc right now. Let's talk about this wonderful Chris craft. So we looked at the Carvel construction and the Lapstrake. This is yet a different kind of construction. What's this, Warren?
Well, this is what they call a batten seam. So behind every one of these blank lines is a batten. And then there's a frame, and the batten is let into that frame. It's just a sawn frame. It has that shape in it, and then the batten is let into it and screw fastened, and on either side of the plank there will be two screws that fasten the planking to the batten. And the idea was that you could make these tiny, tiny little seams. You didn't have to drive cotton into it like the Carvel plank. You could have just these exquisite little seams that didn't sort of take your eye away from this beautiful mahogany. And they spent time book matching their mahogany. They are super careful with their mahogany. And then they had a Chris Craft red stain that made it all look the same. So there's some cheating going on in this this boat.
But it does give it that distinctive look. You can tell a Chris craft the minute you see one.
I think there's a lot about look, do you think?
Yeah.
I mean, yikes.
A beauty queen, that's for
So
sure.
we took that word practicality and just pitched it out back, and we did one at IYRS. It was called a utility. Well, utility. Anyway, it's same though. It was, the mahogany was gorgeous. The detailing's gorgeous. I mean, one of these companies, wasn't it called Auto Car, Auto Boat, Auto something or other? The steering wheel, everything.
They took a lot of style design from the 1940s and 1950s sports cars and luxury cars. So you definitely felt as if you were driving across the lake to your country club when you're in one of these, albeit at a vast rate of knots.
Yeah, and it Go Sporty in 1940.
Oh, I like that.
And then the Garwood, which is another super famous, these mahogany runabout people. It's a whole different tribe, but they're fabulous. We were so lucky to do a Garwood and a Chris Craft at the school. But that was Have Fun in 41 was the Garwood, excuse me. But anyway, the other thing about this boat is that you do have a powerful engine in it, and you are going to leap over waves, and you have to impress people. So the bottom of them, we have that batten seam, single plank construction coming down, and then you have quite a substantial longitudinal, and it's called the chine, and it has a rabbet for this planking, and then a rabbet to receive the bottom planking. The bottom, it has to deal with flying through the air or whatever you have to do to impress someone. It has diagonal planking in it, and then that is covered by fore and aft planking. So quite often they're triple planked, the bottom of these boats. And when you restore them, quite often you start with a bottom that is so tired of leaping through the air and landing on another wave that it's called, in the parlance of the restoration people, a 5200 bottom. And,
I know what that means.
That's this
what does that mean?
lovely adhesive go.
3M 5200 is the most amazing caulk adhesive.
And
it's cheating.
And it won't leak. So
yeah.
This is another ball game.
Yeah.
I have
or they
to
get
say.
fiberglassed as well.
Yeah, if you just tie it in with one of those, you'll be all set.
Now, speaking of the utility of the boat and the use of the boat, we mentioned that the Peapod was built for strength, that it also handled heavy water if necessary very well because of the design. Now, this, as you mentioned, is designed to go skimming across not very high waves, but lakes at vast rates of speed. So what kind of framing would be necessary in the construction of a boat like this to make sure that it wouldn't simply crack in half?
To make sure, I'm not so sure.
To try to prevent, let's say.
So it has what's called sawn frames in it. So the inside is this shape that you see with all that flare forward, sawn right into, well, it's a frame of depth, but it's only sawn to shape. The pram and the Peapod, it's a steam bent frame. So all that grain just runs, continuously through the rib, no sweat. These are basically sawn into a flat board, and then wherever there is a joint, it's gusseted. So there's two other pieces of wood clamping the thing together and fastened. It's here it is, it's still here, but it's an interesting way to build a boat. It was fast, cheap. The impression, you want to make the impression, it's all on the outside of the boat. I had an English student, and he rebuilt the transom on the crisscross we did, and he couldn't stand it, how it was put together. Oh no. And he would do all these bridle joints and all these special joints, whereas Mr. Chris of Chris Crafts said, build a framework, screw to it, the planking will hold it together. And they'll buy a new one in 7 years or so, or maybe next year. So it's a different ballgame. I'm not denigrating the construction, it's just that it's different parameters.
It's the purpose, horses for courses. It's the reason why something is built as a workhorse, albeit a workhorse with great natural style, and something built as a show horse.
This is show horse.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's the people that restore the hardware, the steering wheels, the engines, the dials. There's a guy in Milwaukee just does dials, a couple in Oregon that just does wheels.
Sounds like a car guy.
It's
exactly.
It's amazing.
Yeah, it is.
And a lot of these, for us, or for me, you get involved with the restoration, and it's cool to tap all that. And then you do another boat, and you get to tap another gang and fool them into helping you, and then you go on. So
it is a wonderful thing. Warren, you've hit on so many of the great themes. The reason why David and I wanted to do this show is because of the way art and craft come together in beauty and form and utility is, I think, unmatched in this show, certainly in anything we've done here in the museum, and we are absolutely ecstatic to be able to partnered with IYRS and to be able to exploit in the best way possible your knowledge, your experience, the wonderful experience of the students that you have there at the school, And it's also very interesting as well because many people think of IYRS as a place that, oh, they just repair old boats. But the fact that technologies that you're working on there cover the latest techniques in boat building as well. Is that not true?
The latest? No, I had to, well, in the composite segment of the program, you're definitely learning about materials that are a bit more modern than this. However, we try to rationalize our existence by saying, well, wait a second, wood is almost the primordial composite material. And so if I went from wood to composites in my career, wood to composites, back to wood. And I just find the intrinsic strength of the material and the intrinsic beauty affords something that I didn't quite achieve in the composites. The composite race boats we built, once they were painted, you forget all about all that stuff. But it was always a little bit more intriguing, I felt, from the front office than on the floor. And so when I had an excuse to slide back into wood, I did. But I mean, I find it incredibly fascinating how light and strong a component can be made now with the carbon and all those materials. And I just have to sort of sneak back into the wood world because I'm more comfortable there.
Well, I think that we here at the Audrain certainly celebrate in automobiles and in every object that we celebrate the entire process of development, and we learn so much more about what's happening in the automotive world today by understanding what happened in the automotive world at its very inception. And we learn so much about how things are built and why they are built by studying other objects of motion and art, such as boats. Warren, I'd like to thank you so much for joining us in this exhibition, and once again, thanks for the partnership with IYRS. It's a great thing for this wonderful exhibition, and we're so glad that you could join us.
Well, thank you.
So, continue please to watch our videos here on the Audrain Museum Network, and if you're not a subscriber, which everyone should be by now, come and join us. Press that subscribe button, hit the bell icon to be notified when we put up great new content like this, and of course, follow us on Instagram. We're heading to 50,000, so you better be on board with us. Thanks for watching. We'll see you in the next show.